Most of you know that Halloween is really big around here. For the last 3 years, we've turned our sanctuary upstairs into a haunted house, and we have filled it with ghosts and ghouls and mummies and moans. It's super fun. Now, this past year, I think it was the best that we've ever done, if I do say so myself. I wrote the script as if it were a ghost tour, and we were bringing people, guests, right, through our sanctuary and inviting them to meet our resident ghosts, those that wouldn't quite leave when they were wanted to, from the over-eager greeter to the organless organ player, astutely portrayed by 1K Carpin. It was cool. Now, I played Pastor Byrne, a haunt of a reverend that wouldn't leave his beloved pulpit. At the exact moment that the tour guide steered our watchful guests down the chancel stairs and in front of the pulpit, I would leap up, and I was backlit in red light and surrounded in this puff of smoke. And I would scream at the top of my lungs, "Repent, sinners, or be cast into the fiery pits of hell." And then I would disappear. And I'd wait for 4 minutes until I did it again. It was a lot of fun to scare the bejesus out of one group after another, even if it was absolutely exhausting. It got a huge reaction, right? It was well-timed. It's super creepy. It's a surprise. And of course, the whole sin talk goes a long way to putting people on edge. And when you tie one's sins to this supposed eternal damnation, that certainly gets people even more freaked out, right? It plays to my childhood nightmares, absolutely. But sometimes the only way that we can think about our sin these days is in ways that we have rejected this hurtful theology, right? Where this bad God up in the clouds is just waiting to catch us doing our worst so he can get us. That's like the only way we really kind of talk about our personal sin a lot of times. But that's not the understanding of sin in Wesleyan theology. It's not our tradition. Not at all, in fact. You don't end up with a God seeking to smite us when you start with God being the unlimited and unbounded source of love, life, and creation. God saw everything that God had made, and indeed it was very good. The Genesis writers make sure we get this point. God's declaration of creation's goodness, it's repeated. You know the story. It's repeated over and over and over for our benefit, I think. We are not only made in God's image, we, along with all of creation, we're pronounced good. But a few chapters later, we see that goodness in humanity tested and fail in the narrative of Eden. The writers struggle to understand how we can be good and still somehow be unable to stop doing or choosing or even thinking bad. Now, the tension in our sacred scripture remains there for very good reason. It can't be edited out any more than we can say resolutely how sin works in our world and what shape evil takes exactly. We continue to wrestle with these things, with our own complexity and with the nature of this world that we're born into, right? John Wesley likens sin and humankind to a state of sleep. He describes, I warn you, it's using gendered language, but I'm going to keep it for a purpose. Humanity's sinful sleepiness. Here goes. The poor unawakened sinner, how much knowledge soever he may have as to other things, has no knowledge of himself. In this respect, he knoweth nothing as he ought. He knows not that he is a fallen spirit, whose only business in the present world is to recover from his fall, to regain that image of God wherein he was created. So according to Wesley, until we become aware of God's grace at work in and around us, we sort of sleepwalk through our lives. And in that state, the sins that we commit, the sins we participate in, they're unknown to us as such, as sins, because we don't connect our actions to the divine. And therefore, we can't see where we miss that mark of our design to love God and neighbor fully. Now, this state of unseeing, not connecting us all to each other and to our God, it's the root of sin and the fertile soil for what we refer to as evil. Not the workings of something outside of us, but inside of us, when we are deeply rooted in self-service, a negation of other, a negation of God. Theologian Reinhold Niebuhr puts it this way: it is because humanity can transcend nature and ourselves that we're able to conceive of ourselves as the center of all life and the clue to the meaning of existence. It is this monstrous pretension of our egoism, the root of all imperialism and human cruelty, which is the very essence of sin. Now, when we humans sink into that sinfulness and imagine ourselves to be the center of life, we follow the footsteps of Cain. And I'm reminded of Cain and how he behaves when God shows preference to the sacrifices of Abel over his own. Cain was very angry, and his countenance fell. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry, and why is your countenance fallen? If you do well, will you not be accepted? And if you do not do well, sin is lurking at your door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it." Now here, God characterizes sin as a fallen gaze, one turned in on itself. Cain can no more hear what God is telling him than he can see the good in his brother receiving divine praise. Cain has essentially erected a wall, separating him from his brother, but also from God. It's remarkable to me that God tells Cain exactly what he should do. Did you catch that? He should rejoice with his brother and resist the pull of sin towards an action of evil. And God tells him he must master it, which implies what? That he can. Exactly. We never talk about that part of the story. It's not outside of him. The potential to resist lives inside, right alongside the seeds of that self-centeredness and sin. That kind of clutch of self over other leads us to commit wrongs, actual sins as they're referred to. It's when we voluntarily fail to fulfill the call of God, when we're not actively widening that circle of love in the world. We shut out God, we shut out our siblings, and we give in to this inward gaze of sin. This week, my mom and I were talking, and we're both members of Al-Anon groups as family members of addicts. And she was leading a group session on step 8. Anybody know what that is? Step 8 reads like this. It's a doozy. Make a list of all persons we have harmed and become willing to make amends to them all. It's a seriously difficult task, this number 8, folks. It leads to another seriously difficult task in step 9, when you actually make amends to those folks. But let's stay with step 8 for the moment. Mom and I were talking about it because of this sermon and its topic. They go hand in hand, really, because that task is all about identifying sins, listing them out for ourselves, taking responsibility for them, naming who they harm. We were talking about how in church, those of us who don't go to the fire and brimstone kind of worship spaces rarely talk about sin at all. Or if we do, it's structural sin and not the personal kind. We sort of skip it. We talk about grace and love and justice, but the sin part is the cause of why we need grace and love and justice. She said to me, my mom that is, when you stop talking about sin theologically and instead talk about your own sins, well, it's really, really hard. It's heavy and it hurts. And she's right, of course, because when we do wrong, and even if the sins we commit aren't the big ones, the ones that get all the attention, right, and the top 3 of kind of the 10 Commandments, if we don't think about it, then we don't think we sin. But it doesn't make them less right just because they don't get top billing. And it doesn't stop the hurt as a result of our actions. It also doesn't stop the weight that we carry because we try to move on past our wrongs as if we'd never done them to begin with. So think with me. If you had to write a list of the wrongs that you'd done and who'd been hurt by them, consider silently just for a moment what might you write on that list. If you're like me, even the thought of writing the list is scary. It's actually unnerving in your body. Not to mention understanding that once they're written down, once you acknowledge them, the list would require you to follow up with actions of repair. Can't just name them if you don't want to deal with them. And our resistance, it confirms what we know, even if we don't articulate it. We'd rather talk about sin distantly, or, best of all, in somebody else. Thank you very much. That's my personal favorite. Or in theory or in theology, right? We go very meta, very meta. If we talk on a meta level, then we don't have to change. If we talk in theory, we get by as we are. Because, like Frank said, we're okay. We don't want to hurt anybody. We don't want to hurt ourselves. We don't want to hurt the goodness that God is birthing in the moment. But we're humans, and we live in a world that doesn't operate for the common good of all. It's why Jesus came to the world, to love it, to love us. Guess what? We needed it. We needed it. And it's just plain hard to sit with our own sin-sick souls. Charles Wesley writes, "Heaven, find me on my knees. Hear my soul impassioned pleas. Depth of mercy can there be? Mercy still reserved for me." Now, as we name our sins, account for them, and repair for them when we can, we are released. We're restored and we are redeemed again because God's mercy is always available. And we continue to try and choose goodness, our own godliness over sin, which is lurking at our door. But that's us. Then there's this world to consider, the one that the Genesis writers were also trying to figure out through that garden narrative before. What about the sin that is just held in place by our world, this pressurized state of a sinned world, and the way that it acts out power, privilege, and wealth in our societies? It's what's usually referred to as societal or structural sin. This sin calls us as Christians to the work of social justice, right? We are called to follow Jesus and to topple these sinful structures of our societies where they infect or diminish or harm our siblings. We're called to do more than just identify them and these forces that control us all. We're actively to take kingdom justice wherever it's needed, whenever it's needed, to our communities, our homes, even our churches. Now this week, as I was thinking through how there's a connection between this self-centered, self-promoting sin and this structural sin of the world, and the one that invades everything around us, a news story broke from my home state of Mississippi. In a massive orchestrated effort, ICE raided several food processing plants, targeting immigrant workers, and it resulted in, as we know, over 680 arrests. 680 arrests. That number is so huge. I had to sit with it for a minute to put it back into the context of the towns that number even comes from. Towns named Bay Springs, Carthage, Canton, Morton, and Pelahatchie. These aren't big places, y'all. These are small towns where people know each other, they depend on each other, they've been there for 10, 13, 14 years. Towns where it's really hard not to bump into somebody you know every time you open your door. 680 people, 680 lives, 680 of our Deborahs. As I imagine those people taken from their spouses, their children, their families, and their friends from those small towns, it felt like a distorted rapture. And the entity operating it all believes itself to be the center of the universe, an agency fit to decimate whole communities, workplaces, and human lives. Now, if that doesn't sound like structural sin, then I don't know what does. And we can see in ICE the stutter step, I think, between sin and evil. How quickly one sin, one denial of a human can lead to a collection of sins, of decisions made by those in power that go unchecked, which operate an entire system of sins, racism, classism, xenophobia, and pretty soon you get a full-blown force, an evil, purporting itself to be a prosecutor, a judge, an executioner, and a god, all rolled up into one. And then I think back to Cain. And I find it very important to note that not one line of text separates God's advice to Cain to work against the lure of sin from Cain's action to take his brother out into a field and kill him. The space between one sin and an act of evil is but a moment in the narrative. No words. No words. A breath. And when we shut down our connection to the divine, when we close our kinship to our siblings, we are susceptible either to doing or to allowing terrible things to happen. We kind of invite back that sleepiness, that unknowingness of wrongs around us. We adopt a false unseeing of injustice, stop being an obstacle that evil must overcome, and start being a part of its permissibility. It's why God tells Cain, sin is lurking at your door, its desire is for you, but you must master it. You can, God is saying too. Toni Morrison once told a group of students at Harvard that evil has a blockbuster audience. Evil is a top hat, she says, and it has tap shoes on, and it's on stage, and it's hollering, and goodness is backstage, waiting. But evil's always taken up all the energy because it is nothing. It's got to have a costume. It's got to be loud. Goodness, all too often, bites its tongue. The raids are loud and they're violent and they're acts done to intimidate and strike fear into an already vulnerable community. But it didn't take hours. It didn't take hours until goodness released its tongues and started to speak. Many of those taken into custody, as has been reported over and over, thank God, left children behind who became temporarily homeless and parentless. Strangers picked up those kids from school. A small town, Forest, opened its community gym, and they took in the children before they had a plan of what to do with them. People started bringing by food, sleeping bags, clothes, games. The impromptu leaders who made this happen assured the kids of a place to stay and a car ride to school the next day. One of those leaders said this: everybody needs to hold the kids first and foremost in their minds And that's what we've tried to do here, is give them a place to stay and ease the pain just a little bit. Goodness is right there, waiting to be chosen over sin. And it's here, inside of us, and can be chosen just as easily. Charles Wesley wrote so much on the state of sin, but never in a way that left us to our own conclusions. He believed, just as John Wesley did, that the human problem was not an inability to love, to do good, or even to be restored to God, but that humans simply love the wrong things in the wrong way. As author Paul Chakotay put it, instead of loving God as our ultimate end and goal, God's children love their Creator as a means to their own ends. I find it especially telling that Charles is most often referred to Jesus in his hymns with this phrase: Jesus was a friend of sinners. He used it over and over again. We are not doomed to sin, desolate in our sin-stained nature. We are beloved. We are chosen. We are friended, and we are forgiven by Jesus. And we are still sinners, persons who provide residence to sin, even in a body and in a spirit that houses the image of God. The Wesleys believed and handed down to us through our tradition that God's amazing grace was revealed to us in a supreme act of love in Jesus. And the Methodist tradition is simply not the Methodist tradition without grace. Grace, grace, God's grace. Grace that is greater than all our sin. The emphasis of our belief system is not based on what we can do right, what we can do wrong, but what God offers us anyway. It is our purpose then, as followers of the way of Jesus, to extend that grace, to widen the net of love, to expand God's goodness to this very broken and needy world and everybody who fills it. We must master sin. At least we've got to try.